We're very fortunate to have Mr. Kirk Steudle here with us. He's the director of the Michigan Department of Transportation. MDOT has a $4 billion budget, over 10,000 miles of road, 4,000 bridges, 2,500 employees. In addition to being the transportation director since 2001, in 2004, he was the chair of the TRB Executive Committee. He's a national leader in the development of connected vehicle technology. And in 2015, Kirk was named one of America's top 25 government innovators by Government Technology. So please welcome Mr. Kirk Steudle.
Well, good morning, everybody. Oh, come on, you know it's afternoon. That was a trick question. But the industry's changed a lot, too. The acceptance, the use of all the different types of applications have certainly changed. It's great to be here. Hope you are enjoying Traverse City. For those of you that are out of this state and your first time here, hope you have found a new gem in the Midwest. And we'd love to have all of you spend lots of money, come back later, spend some more money. And if you're from certain states, go home. No, I'm just kidding. You might get like Larry and decide to move here permanently because it does kind of grow on you after a while. I've had a family place here that my parents bought before I was born, so this place has kind of been in my blood for 50 plus years. So we're gonna do a little bit of rehash. Some of it you already know, right? Pavement preservation is about the right fix, the right place, at the right time. So that's where we were, right? 2005. I remember this was the main focus. Why are we doing this? What are we doing? It was all about education. Where we started in Michigan, thanks to Larry's help, 1991, really started the pavement preservation movement. That year we had a whole $6 million of preservation contracts out in the street. There's the different types, roughly covered about 700 lane miles. And where are we now? Well, 2016 it's $92 million. Same variety. The mix has changed over time. I've seen it go up and down, but frankly, the biggest thing to me is that you all, the engineers, decide what's the right fix for the right road at the right time, and here's a program that can help get us there. We know from Michigan's perspective that without this, the road network would have fallen apart a lot sooner than it has. It would be in a lot worse condition today without the efforts of the pavement preservation techniques, the pavement preservation professionals within Michigan, but I suspect within each of your states as well. So there's the breakdown of the different types of treatments. And the one that I think is the most interesting is the bottom one, on emerging technologies. And for the MDOT staff in the room, that's not surprising to them. They know I would like to push what's next, where are we going next, how do we innovate, how do we do something different, how do we make something last longer. And while it's a small piece, it's a very important piece because that's what ultimate innovation comes from, is experimenting, trying, and seeing how you can push the envelopes. About the same time that we were talking about a capital preventative maintenance was also the discussion nationally about transportation asset management. And about that same time, early mid-2000s, I was very involved with AASHTO's asset management task force at the time. It was before it was a subcommittee, before it was combined with performance measures, and said, you know what, this just makes sense. And these techniques help us manage a system over its whole life cycle. And we said we really start blending these together, and it really becomes a philosophy of how you manage a network, right? We're here as public employees, to the public employees in the audience. We're here not because we're an employment agency, and while it's nice that you get a check, we're actually here because the public said, we want you to take care of this road network that we've invested public money in. we want you to take care of it, and we want you to make wise decisions with it. So asset management was the effort, along with capital preventive maintenance, to look at its entirety, look at the life cycle of a particular asset, and decide how do you get the most from it. And frankly, every single one of you does that at home. All of your relatives do it at home, and it's a matter of how do you connect that personal reaction and that personal responsibility to the public responsibility that you have in managing an asset. So the Asset Management Council of Michigan was created in 2001. I was one of the initial members of that council. And it's got DOT, it's road commissions, regional planning agencies, metropolitan planning agencies, local governments as well. And it's expanded the role of asset management across the state. They're required every year to track progress. They go out and do data collection and say, what's the condition? And was nobody surprised that the good roads or the miles are getting worse and the poor miles are going up. It's been a story we've been talking about for a long time here in Michigan. I know all of you other states are having similar discussions, probably with your legislators. The Asset Management Council became very, very important over the last 2 or 3 years as we've had a debate about funding and raising revenue, because they were set up as the honest broker of data. So here's the data. While they all have an opinion, it was all the data is going to drive the discussion and drive the decision. And when you put these charts up, there wasn't a legislator anywhere that could say, well, that's wrong. They could say it, but we would say, prove they're wrong. This has 10 years worth of data behind it, actual data, somebody physically looking at it. So it was very, very powerful here in Michigan. In fact, so much, a year and a half ago, Governor Snyder introduced the 21st Century Infrastructure Commission. And that commission was to look at all public assets. I referred to those as the building blocks of society. If we're going to a third world country, what do they want? They want a good road or a road. In many cases, they want a road. They want water, they want sewer, they want electricity, and they want broadband. And they want gas, power, however that might be getting to them. So you take all of those, whether they're under Public Service Commission or they're under an individual municipality or state government, and you say, without one of those, just think about your life. Without one of those at your home, your day changes, doesn't it? All of a sudden you don't have power at home. What you're doing at work isn't as important, is it? Because you don't have power at home. That's priority number one. If the well doesn't work, okay, your first priority that day is to get the well working. I had some well issues at my family place this weekend. It was getting the well working. So the governor put together a task force and said, I want you to look at all of these, and I want an honest look in the mirror. Where are we at? And then I want you to project forward 30 to 50 years and say, what do we need? And then address what's the shortfall. How do we get there in between? And there was lots of discussions about when the actual look in the mirror happened and said, oh, well, that number's too big. That's not going to be politically acceptable. We got to do something that's more manageable. They say, stop. It's not what the governor asked us to do. The governor asked us to give us an honest look. Take the politics out of this. Honest look. The group out of 21 people had 14 professional engineers. Now, when was the last commission created in a state government that had that many professional engineers? I can't think of one, but it was great. They came back to let the data drive the discussion. So in the end, they came up with the fact that it needed $4 billion additional investment per year. So you heard the transportation budget is about $4 billion. That's for roads and bridges across the state and mass transit for 620 agencies. It needs an additional $4 billion, and that's also private utilities, public utilities, so think of the phone company, AT&T, Verizon, so broadband, water, sewer, $4 billion. sticker shock within the legislature. But it's based on facts. It's the data. It says, look, here's what it is. If you want to pretend something else, okay, but you're just fooling yourself. So it's one of the key pieces within that report was asset management and pavement preservation. They said, as they searched across the country, they came back to the fact and says, wow, you know what? Michigan is really kind of leading the country in this asset management. Not leading the country, they're doing the best practices that they're establishing around the world. Maybe we should come back to this and recognize that that Asset Management Council is really doing some pretty groundbreaking stuff. And what they're doing with preventative maintenance to lengthen the life of an asset is a best practice around the globe, not just around the country. So it was really heartening from an engineer's perspective to have the group say, yeah, something you've been involved with for the last 15 years is actually on the right track. And then knowing where pavement preservation started, where asset management started, it was great to see it. It was blended through that whole report about maintaining an asset. So what's next? Where do we go? Remember I talked about innovation? So here's a couple of them. You guys are going to dive into the technical stuff, and I'm not going to even pretend to be able to be the expert on that. Okay, that's a cart. I thought that was an airplane. I'm not going to pretend to be the expert. You guys have that expertise, the mixture of state and private companies that will help drive what emerges next. How do we get more life out of this? From an innovative contracting perspective, one of the pieces that I know that we are experimenting with is fixed price variable scope. It says, all right, I got this much money. Now, if you all bid on it, tell me how far can we get down the road? What is it we can do? How do I get the best value for that money as we go down the road? It's more difficult from a government perspective to contract that way, but it's better for the asset in the long term, and it's better for the taxpayer in the long term because we get the best value for money, not just the lowest price on what we thought we ought to do. So we're going to be moving that way as well. So I would ask you guys that the next day or two while you're sharing information, is there, or what's the next new treatments to preserve our pavements? I'll bet everybody's got an idea. I was just over grabbing a cup of coffee. I think there's people in the other rooms got some ideas. And then is there a better way to deliver it, right? What's the best way? I know when Larry was starting preventative maintenance in Michigan, it was a different contracting method. Maintaining traffic wasn't spelled out where every barrel was. It was a lot of things that were different from the traditional contracting method. Well, now that's just, of course we would do it that way. Well, it's time to begin to think again. How is there another way to evolve, and how do you deliver that better? So I want to spend the last couple minutes here, we're kind of just talking about national trends, what's going forward. The FAST Act, we're in the middle of implementation. Had some really good pieces in there about performance measures. Performance measures are going to help drive a lot of decisions. I think most people will start to realize in your agencies that without preventative maintenance, you're not going to get to those performance measures, those goals. You're not going to reach them. And you've got to embrace them. The second one, environmental permitting, you may or may not have heard the governor signed an executive order a couple of weeks ago that streamlined environmental processing. It was pretty significant because it really forced all of the U.S. Department agencies into one decision and forced them all to the table at the same time, so that we get out of this, okay, well, Fish and Wildlife says this, and the Corps of Engineers says this, and then the EPA says this, and many times they're at odds with each other, and I think sometimes they were at odds with each other just so they could tie you up. So it couldn't go forward. And the president has said, we want to get this time to get environmental permits down from 7 years to 2. Now that's a pretty ambitious goal. But the pieces that he put in place that said, all right, you federal agencies have to embrace this and figure out how you make this happen faster. And he put the Department of Management and Budget in charge of monitoring them. And he said that'll be taken into account next year at budget time. So we'll see if it's got some teeth. but frankly, that was a really big step. I can tell you, my Midwest colleagues, this was one of the issues that was on probably your secretary, director, commissioner, wherever state you happen to be in, and mine agenda. We had numerous conversations with the administration after they came in, offered suggestions about things that could happen in environmental processing, and permitting was one of them. It was on the top of our list and said, here's things you could do. And frankly, we were really happy, really pleased that they listened and came forward with this executive order. There's a couple other things on that list that we're hoping they're listening to as well. And in fact, this Wednesday, we have another meeting with Secretary Chow in the White House again to help push some additional issues, primarily on the President's infrastructure package. How do we help influence? And what he's really interested in is how do we put a national infrastructure package together that helps rural communities. And we've been looking at that saying, well, how do we do something in rural Michigan, right? So while Traverse City seems kind of built up and urban, you don't have to drive more than about 40 miles away and you'll be in very rural Michigan. It'll look very much rural like every other state that's sitting here. And the challenges there are the same challenges that you have. You know, there's a lot of miles of road, there's not a lot of people. It's important, it's got to be there. They connect communities. How do we find a niche for that within the federal government? So you can expect that there'll be more of that. Funding, obviously funding is the first time that it's actually consistent. We actually know what's coming. Is it enough? Nope. Well, that's where we have to use all the tools in the toolbox, right? Everything that you're talking about here has to be on the top of the table so you can figure out how do you manage this network and how do you get the best bang for the buck all the way through. So there'll be more discussions about funding. I think the President's plan for $1 trillion is now getting scaled back to 200 billion. I never thought people would think that $200 billion is like not a lot of money. But when you put out $1 trillion and say, well, maybe it's going to be 200 billion, 200 billion, that's a lot of money. That's still a big impact across the country. Now, what does it look like? Is it going to be public-private partnerships? Is it private money? Well, there's issues with all of that. But the fact of the matter is they're talking about it at a high level. And we'll see how it all plays out. I am really encouraged. This is the first time in history that the White House has had an advisor to deal with just infrastructure. His name is DJ Gribbins. He used to work as the chief legal counsel under Secretary Peters, and he worked for KPMG after he left Peters in the Bush administration. He worked for KPMG, worked for Macquarie for a while, and he now is appointed since January. He works in the White House on the infrastructure plan. So that's the first time that's ever happened. Usually it's been an afterthought. So a lot of the interaction that we've had have come because DJ understands transportation. He was in DOT earlier, and he knows many of us, or those of us that have been hanging around since dirt was created. So that's coming. Not on the list, but Jerry asked about was this Future of the Interstate Commission, of which I happened to be on. It was 14 people, and frankly, I was quite honored to be selected to be on that. There is one other DOT person. It's the head of planning from the Arizona Department of Transportation, largely because this was set up as it was going to be modeling, and we were going to do future modeling as to what the interstate needed. And it's since shifted away from that. But then the rest of the people are from MPOs, from academia. So as I reminded them all one day, I said, look, I'm the only one that has responsibility for any miles of the interstate of everybody sitting at this table. And what you're talking about is not important. They were off on some tangent somewhere and just said, hey, come back here, right? Because what Congress asked us to do was, what's it going to take? What's the future interstate look like? But more importantly, if we just maintain what we have, how much is that going to cost? That was question number one, basic question number one. And then it was look down the road and say, okay, well, what's coming? Because in the 1940s, There was lots of discussions about an interstate system. What do we need? How should it be funded? All of that conversation was happening, and it wasn't until 55 when Eisenhower signed it that it kind of got solidified. Lots of conversations before that. But if you think about the interstate system we have today, it was largely thought about and created 60, 70 years ago. So if we just want to rebuild the 1970s version, that's okay. Some of you, any of you have a classic car at home? Any of you drive it to work every day? Right, that's crazy, right? So who would rebuild a classic 1970 interstate and then expect to drive it to work every day? That's nuts. So what the commission is looking at is saying, okay, well, what does it need to be changed to? What do the standards need to look like? Not design standards, global standards. How do we do the discussion about capacity, right? Some places there's excess capacity. Maybe some of your states, I can think of a couple places here that maybe have excess capacity. And are there places that need to be bigger? I can think of a couple places here that need to be bigger. In all of your states, there's places that need to be bigger. What does it need to look like? And then project it further and say, well, what are the delivery techniques, right? We've been doing design, bid, build forever. Okay, should that be the way it continues? What new techniques are out there? Who's experimenting with them? And we just talked about fixed price variable scope. Is that in the mix? And the commission report won't say you should do this or this. It will say here's the options that are out there, and all of these ought to be explored. And then the fourth phase is, okay, well now really stretch. Commission, really stretch and say, what kind of advanced technology should we be prepared for? Automated and connected vehicles, really hot topic in Michigan, hot topic in a number of your states. And what does that do? What does that do to urban areas? What does it do to freeways? Remember, we're talking specifically about the interstate. So you have to think about that urban mobility is in two phases. One, it's one thing to do mobility in a downtown area where everybody's driving 25 miles an hour or less. It's the same technology, but handled completely different on an interstate where the design and look and feel are very similar. So I'll open it up for questions, but I will just add that the discussion of the future of the interstate, the commission meetings are really fascinating. I mean, it's really kind of wide open, and you just think about the task of how do you just pull all of this together for an interstate that hits every single state, that is the wonder of the world, and then how do you project forward? What does it need to look like in 30 or 50 years? Wow, you better have a big crystal ball, or you better have a lot of flexibility in it. I mean, just think about the technology. Smartphones have been here for 10 years. Okay, what are they going to be 10 years from now? Well, I'll bet we're going to be riding in autonomous cars. So we could go on about that for a long time. So I'd be happy to take anybody's questions, anything else you want to hear about or chat about. I'd be happy to fill you in.
All right, there's been some discussion about freight and freight corridors a lot in the most recent act. Can you speak a little bit about that as far as where that is and maybe the progression and how that indeed kind of ties into potentially these interstate corridors?
Yeah, so that's a great one because from a commission perspective, we've looked at freight modeling, freight flows, because if you think about, well, while we all use the interstate system for us to take a leisure travel or a business trip, its primary purpose is to move commerce. It's about moving freight, and it's by freight by truck. But at the same time, you've got parallel rail lines, and you've got short sea shipping, whether it's the Great Lakes or the Mississippi River, and then out on the coast with big ocean-going shipping. But the fact is, and I don't know the statistics for your states, but here in Michigan, 75% of all freight is moved by truck. Now, it happens that we have 163,000 pound trucks, but so your freight's probably even higher because you got to send two for when we send one. So the commission was looking at the freight flows, and that's one of those things where they said, okay, does the interstate need to be bigger, wider? Does it need to look different? Does it need to have truck-only lanes? Do we need to separate it? And then, frankly, there's places that it just is physically impossible to do that. So then what do you do, right? Have you just now allowed everybody to go really fast up to the bottleneck, and now you just shoved everybody together again, which, frankly, is what the rail industry has in Chicago. All the trains east and west come into Chicago. They used to go into St. Louis, by the way, in the last probably 6 decades. Chicago has kind of pulled it away. Chicago is the bottleneck now, but it all gets real fast to Chicago, then it takes forever to get through Chicago, and then it takes off again. Well, you could have the same thing on the interstate. So, long answer to yes, that is probably one of the primary drivers that people in my seat have to deal with, is how do you move goods? You know, people will get there, but the goods is what keeps the economy moving. When the economy is moving, there's people going to work. When people are going to work, they're paying taxes. You have this big thing called the economy, and you have society. Great question.
Because the questions are so big, are you thinking of interim solutions and saying, you know, we're not going to get to connected vehicles right now. You know, are you thinking of how do we get to the interim solutions to say, when we get there, we'll be ready, but how can you deal with that?
So actually our next meeting is in 2 weeks, and the report format is starting to take shape, and that's one of the topics is, okay, do we talk about short-term, medium-term, long-term? Do we put years around that? Does it say short-term is 5 to 10 years? Or is that medium-term, right? It's so variable. So we're going to have a very robust conversation. Everybody recognizes there does need to be that. It just can't be this, well, here's what you got to do in the future. It's got to be, here's the steps that you got to go, or at least begin down that path.
As part of this, are you actually getting with the industries to forecast autonomous vehicles? Where do they think they're going to be when? All that kind of stuff that goes in the drones, is that all being integrated in what you guys are doing?
So from the commission's perspective, not directly, but from an individual state of Michigan, absolutely we are. So the commission came to Michigan in May. We had a big commission meeting, did a tour, and one of the topics for half of the meeting was connected automobile or connected automation. What does it mean? We had people from the big auto companies in. As we went to a meeting in California, we had Apple and Google in. So we've had opportunities for them to express their thoughts. Won't surprise you that they're all over the board. And I will tell you from my experience, whatever they've publicly said is something that they can very easily get to, and they'll beat it. It is an amazing time right now to be involved in this because the technology is moving just so fast.
I know they're talking a lot about the things that need to happen and need to get done, but as we move forward, a lot of the funding issues are based around, the gas tax and things like that, but a lot of the things industries are talking about move away from gasoline-powered cars. Have they come up with any ideas out there that they're gonna, change that funding mechanism so everybody kind of pays their fair share for the use of roads, or?
So the commission is being careful to not weigh into something that will be viewed highly political, right? You're either endorsing a gas tax or endorsing something. So we want to make sure that that's not the reason people throw the report out. But at the same time, we want to give them options and say, okay, these are the types of things that you ought to be looking at. It's a real fine tightrope to walk because you don't want that the reason that one political party or the other one throws it out and says this thing is garbage, they're just advocating for a gas tax increase. When your point is, look, gas taxes are going to go away. In fact, I just signed a letter the end of last week that went to USDOT for comments about the increased CAFE standards, which is the miles per gallon. And I said, look, that's all well and good for the environment, wonderful. You have to deal with the gas tax and the highway trust fund. That's an impact that you've got to deal with. And while raising the fuel economy is great for all of our pocketbooks, personally, it's bad for all of our paychecks. and we really, so we asked them to take a serious look at what happens to the funding of infrastructure. Now, having said that, I do think it's going to accelerate. Ford Motor Company came out about 6 months ago and said 15 electric models within the next 5 years at Ford Motor Company. Not the startup in the desert that sells a couple 100,000 cars, Ford Motor Company that sells millions of cars. That is a big impact. And if you just look at how many of you used to drive or how many drive a Suburban now or a Tahoe, a big SUV, right? How many of you have driven a Suburban or Tahoe or a big SUV for the last 20 years, right? Okay, so your gas mileage has doubled, hasn't it? It's gone from 10 years ago to probably 20 or 22. That's the biggest impact because they sell a lot of those. If you think about electric cars, at least in the statistic in Michigan, there's only 2% of all registered vehicles are electric vehicles. Hybrids make up a little bit bigger portion, but SUVs are a huge portion, and their fuel economy has doubled. That's the biggest impact to the transportation fund in Michigan, has been the increased fuel economy. So very long answer, but lots of discussion about that, trying to walk that tightrope to not have it turn super political and have the rest of all of the recommendations ignored. We had a very robust conversation about that. There were advocates that said, absolutely got to have it all in here, we got to push them and tell them, and a lot of others said, yeah, that's a good way to have it not read.
So, Director, you travel around the world. I mean, you traveled to Europe, and I think last year you went to Australia. You received the Autonomous Vehicle Award. Where do we stand in Michigan as a nation, comparing to the Europe and other countries as far as autonomous technology is concerned?
From an automotive technologies perspective, I would say that we are near the front. When we were in Australia, there was some neat things happening in the parking lot. Europe is doing some cross-border tests between Austria, Germany, France, and while those are interesting, that's like Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. It's not necessarily the same. The countries that are really leading and they're taking off right now there's one in a big test facility in the Netherlands and Sweden that are kind of leading kind of off-road testing or off public road testing, and then the Chinese. The Asians are really, really pushing. In fact, 2 years ago we opened up this autonomous village called M-City at the University of Michigan. It has since been duplicated in China. In fact, they're going to build 5 more. They came and actually asked if they could have the drawings so that they could build it. And we said, no. So then they just used Google. It looks identical other than the big block M is not there. And then Korea is pushing. They already have one up. It's called Ni-City from an infrastructure perspective. But then if you look at across the United States, there's 10 designated sites for automated vehicle development. One of them in Michigan, and then some in your state, some in Wisconsin. There's another Midwest one as well. But I would say as a country, there's a recognition that we have to stay in front of this or we will be importing the technology from somebody else. It's more than just a nice transportation thing. It really is about economic future of automobile development. So I would answer the fact that we are, while we may not be way out in front, we're certainly nose to nose with anybody else, and it would be ours to lose, and if we don't focus on it, we will lose it and we will import it later. So it's a really big deal as a country. Yep. Well, great. Well, thanks everybody. With that, thank you all very much.
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.